By the summer of 1942, Germany was still victorious. After some unexpected setbacks in Russia, they were once again on the offensive. In North Africa, the First Battle of El Alamein began with Erwin Rommel leading the way. From a military perspective, Germany was at the height of its power, but it was now fighting on three fronts. Losses would be heavy. In September, the Battle of Stalingrad began with much promise. It was a bloody battle of attrition, and one in which Germans were losing. On November 1st, Allied troops break out of El Alamein. 7 days later, Operation Torch begins. Allied troops invade North Africa, with American and British troops landing in Morocco and Algeria. Rommel's fabled Africa Corps is now being squeezed on two sides. November 19th. Soviet forces launch Operation Uranus. Its aim, surround the city of Stalingrad and annihilate all German forces. The Soviet offensive is a spectacular success, and by the end of January 1943, the battle is all but over. The German Sixth Army surrenders. It was the first Nazi acknowledgement of failure. In May, the battle for Tunisia is over. German and Italian forces surrender, with 250,000 troops taken prisoner. These military losses represented a key turning point. Germany was now on the defensive. For the Luftwaffe, January 1st, 1943 represented a time of crisis. Its operational strength had sunk to some 4,000 aircraft. It had also failed to introduce new, more modern types, aircraft like the He-280 and the Me-262. In fact, the Luftwaffe was drawing on its last accumulated reserves. Contingency plans were non-existent. Any new military setback would be catastrophic. The German High Command had resolutely declined the possibility of waging a defensive war. From Hitler on down, the mantra had always been attack. The losses in Stalingrad and North Africa put a severe strain on Luftwaffe resources. For the first time, serious cracks began to show. But it wasn't just the losses in North Africa and Stalingrad that hobbled the once mighty Luftwaffe. The pre-war belief that Germany's military conquests would be short led to short-term planning. New modern aircraft wouldn't be needed. It was a strategic miscalculation, and one that had a direct effect on the development of Heinkel's He-280 and Messerschmitt's Me-262.
Heinkel was up against the German Air Ministry, even though he had Ernst Heinkel as his very good friend and confidant. The German Air Ministry, they wanted a flying machine propeller driven like the Focke-Wulf 190, like the Messerschmitt Bf 109, that were designed for ground support, like in Poland and elsewhere.
For Heinkel, the battle for the He-280 continued. As Germany's fortunes began to change, many still clung to the belief in a rapid victory, even in the second half of 1942. Erhard Milch was one of them. After Udet's suicide, he did manage to increase aircraft production, but at a cost. To avoid Hitler's wrath, Milch was unwilling to add any new types to the assembly lines. Doing so would cause monthly production numbers to fall. As a result, most of the pre-war designs remained in production right until the end of the war. Unfortunately for Heinkel and Messerschmitt, Milch's aversion to risk continued to have its effect in the one field where Germany could establish technical superiority: jet planes. In September 1942, both Erhard Milch and the German Air Ministry agreed. Any preparations for series production of the Me-262 would be premature, and in view of Heinkel's numerous commitments, production of the He-280 was unrealistic as well. It was a curious point of view, but in early 1943, that all changed. In January 1943, Heinkel's He-280 V6 prototype, powered by two Jumo 004 engines, took flight. For the first time, Heinkel pitched this version as a fighter bomber. In a complete about-face, the German Air Ministry changed its mind and began negotiations for the manufacture of 300 280s. It now seemed as if the 280 would finally see mass production and enter service before the Me-262. Ironically, the 262 V4 prototype, powered by the same Jumo 004 engines as Heinkel's new jet bomber, enjoyed a marked performance advantage over its rival. While the HE-280 was thought to be faster with a better rate of climb and ceiling, it only had 2/3 the range. In the end, the 262 was the superior fighter. In a letter dated March 27, 1943, Milch wrote to Heinkel, ending the 280 project. In Milch's letter, he claimed that the overall war situation today no longer allows us to run two designs side by side. For Heinkel, it was a bitter defeat. In a conference shortly after, Heinkel observed that Milch and his colleagues had a noticeable sense of unease about the jet, and the talk was always about jet bombers. For Willy Messerschmitt, victory over Heinkel would prove a Pyrrhic victory. Meanwhile, in Britain, the Gloucester Meteor prototype DG-206 made its first flight. Like the Germans, British officialdom and industry were slow to deliver a reliable jet engine. Official confidence was shaken when the impellers on Whittle's W2B engine continually burst at high speed. This was eventually remedied with imported impellers from General Electric, who in 1941 built their own jet engines based on Whittle's design. Fortunately for the program, Rolls-Royce was called upon to take over development and production of the W2B engine. Back in Germany, development of the Me-262 continued. Compared to the British, the German program was disorganized, inefficient, and veiled in secrecy, even from those who should have known. Surprisingly, Adolf Galland, general of the Luftwaffe fighter arm, was kept in the dark. Not until May 22, 1943, did he fly the fourth 262 prototype. Galland was so impressed that he recommended production of the Bf-109 be halted and changed to the new jet fighter. Galland's enthusiasm swept away any remaining hesitancy and vacillation. 72 hours later, Erhard Milch ordered the 262 into series production. But many questions remained. Why did those involved in the program not see the value of the 262 sooner and act before Galland's endorsement? Why was it kept secret from Galland? And why didn't he fly the HE-280? One can only speculate as to what might have been if just 2 years earlier he had flown the 280. Finally, Messerschmitt had what he wanted, but there was one man who didn't agree. Adolf Hitler rejected out of hand any mass production of the Me-262. Said Hitler, "Nothing will be done with the new jet until I have decided on its merits." Unfortunately for Messerschmitt, the Führer was increasingly obsessed with revenge and retribution. Striking back at the enemy was far more important than providing his fighter arm with a fighter capable of defending the Reich. This would lead directly to Germany's third jet-powered aircraft, the V-1 flying bomb. Powered by a pulse jet engine, the V-1 was the world's first cruise missile and the first jet-powered aircraft to see combat in World War II. Shortly after D-Day, the V-1 bombardment of London began. To help counter the threat, the RAF deployed the first jet fighter, the Meteor Mark I. Compared to the HE-280 and the Me-262, the Meteor was slower. But more importantly, it was a combat-ready machine powered by centrifugal jet engines. Though the German axial flow engine offered more punch, Frank Whittle, the genius behind Britain's early jet engines, was sold on the reliability of centrifugal design.
Now, axial flow engines are much more complex than centrifugal, but much more efficient. Ideally, one should have headed for axial flow. But one has to put oneself back a bit in time and remember where we stood in the history of jet development, and that was not very far along the road. Whittle, quite rightly, when I talked to him, he knew all about axial flow, but I said to him, "Why have you gone this way, Frank, into centrifugal?" And he said, "Because in this present state of the art, I am looking for reliability and simplicity."
In November 1943, Hitler saw the Me-262 for the first time. Hitler scolded those in attendance, asking why, after years of demanding a fast bomber, was he presented with a fighter. Hitler wanted to know if the jet aircraft could carry bombs. Messerschmitt answered in the affirmative. For Hitler, the matter was settled. The Me-262 would be produced as a Blitz bomber. In fact, Messerschmitt disobeyed Hitler and continued to develop his jet solely as a fighter. 6 months later, when Hitler found out, he flew into an incandescent rage. On May 25, 1944, he ordered all 262s to be built as bombers. It was a major blow and added more technical problems to an already troubled program. One of the biggest and ongoing hurdles was the development of the Jumo 004 engine into a reliable power plant. The Jumo 004 was an axial flow compressor design. In theory, it offered more power over the higher drag centrifugal compressor engines used by the British. In practice, however, the Jumo engines were considerably inferior. The shortage of strategic materials like chrome and nickel led to the failure of many substandard turbine blades at high temperatures. The Jumo 004 also suffered from decreased thrust at high altitude, fuel flow problems, and flameouts if the throttle was opened or closed too quickly. The Jumo 004 was a technical and operational failure. Not only did the Jumo 004 have a very short lifespan, it was unreliable, prone to surges, stalls, and fires. This was the Me-262's Achilles heel, one Allied pilots would feast on.
The engines were very sensitive. They were slow to accelerate to throttle movement, and you had to handle them very carefully to avoid flaming them out. Secondly, the designers hadn't thought of how to slow down these incredibly fast airplanes, and no air brakes were fitted. And this made life very difficult, for example, for landing. You need some drag if you're going to land, and since there was very little drag associated with the 262, you had to do a long, slow approach to landing. And this was an Achilles heel, because the 8th USAF Mustangs realized this, and the 262s they picked off were usually in that phase of the operation.
By July 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm was fighting a losing battle. Unable to cope with the swarms of long-range American P-47s and P-51 Mustangs, it was quickly being destroyed. While the Me-262 was in production, the numbers in operational service were meager at best and would remain so until the end of the war. The first American B-17 shot down didn't occur until August 15th. For the Germans, the situation was desperate. Shut out since the rejection of the He-280, Ernst Heinkel was finally brought back into the jet fold. Concerned with the slow production of the Me-262, the German High Command wanted a so-called rush job, a single-engine jet fighter that required little strategic materials to build. For Heinkel, it was a question of pride. Eager to prove himself once more, he accepted the challenge. Heinkel quickly realized that in order for the jet to work, the engine had to be mounted just above the fuselage, similar to the V-1. 12 days after the specification had been issued, the He-162 mock-up was ready. On September 23, 1944, Heinkel's He-162 was selected for mass production. Captain Eric Brown recalls demonstrating the He-162 to Heinkel in a post-war test flight.
He was like a schoolboy jumping up and down with delight, and asked very piercing questions about the handling of the aircraft. He had heard about the disaster we'd had with it. I found him with a very acute mind and struck me as a highly intelligent person.
By late 1944, the German High Command was fueled by fear, fantasy, and pathological denial. Galland said that the He-162 was unrealistic. To mass-produce such a crude and untried aircraft and expect it to be flown by inexperienced Hitler youth was beyond reality. Even at this late stage of the war, Heinkel was working on at least 26 different versions. Using slave labor, 100 aircraft were produced in February of 1945. On February 6th, the first group converted to the new type. In the final weeks of the war, the so-called People's Fighter saw little action. Combat claims were made but never confirmed. Only one HE-162 was ever shot down by an Allied fighter. On May 5th, Germany surrendered. It was a crushing defeat. The new jet and rocket fighters introduced late in the war had no impact on the outcome. Many have argued that if the HE-280 had been produced sooner, history would have been different. Perhaps, but in the final analysis, the 280 wouldn't have made a dramatic difference. For Ernst Heinkel, there was a deep bitterness. His early groundbreaking developments were essentially ignored. As to who actually killed the world's first jet fighter, the answer is many. The HE-280 was quite simply a victim of mismanagement and industrial chaos. After 1936, Nazi management of the aviation industry was not centralized. Udet's technical office, Göring, the general staff, Milch, and all the aircraft designers jockeyed with one another for control of the aviation program. Instead of a uniform, consistent policy towards aircraft production, confusion and chaos reigned.
Göring must hugely accept blame for a lot of the failings of the Luftwaffe, particularly the delay and the mismanaging getting aircraft into production. And to a large extent, Udet was one of his causes of his problem. Udet was an extroverted, magnificent exhibition pilot in civil life, and he had been in Göring's squadron in World War I. Ernst Udet had no interest in politics, and Göring approached him as an old squadron mate and said, you know, the Nazi Party needs you and your experience. Come in and be the head of our technical department. Udet was talked into this and was completely out of his depth.
Firms like Heinkel and Messerschmitt tried to build everything from trainers to strategic bombers. Every effort made by the Air Ministry to move them towards any specialization was effectively countered. Clear-cut technical objectives were never issued. Programs were allowed to continue regardless of the enormous waste in time, skill, and materials. Overall, the Nazi management of the aircraft industry was uncoordinated, inefficient, plagued by ignorance and incompetence. Even if the HE-280 had become operational in 1942, its overall effectiveness would have been limited. It all came down to the Jumo 004 power plant. Unreliable with a critically short lifespan, it was not ready for combat operations. Serviceability rates would have been low, as was the case with the Me-262. Finding good pilots would have been another issue. The number of newly trained pilots could barely keep pace with attrition. Fuel shortages also began to take hold. By 1943, the Luftwaffe was a dying force with no chance of recovery. As the world's first jet fighter, Heinkel's HE-280 was a marvel of technology and inspiration. Unfortunately for Heinkel, those in power saw little use for his twin-jet fighter. Hitler's reluctance to produce jets almost certainly doomed what little hope Germany had of ever producing an effective jet fighter force. As the Allies sifted through the spoils of their victory, the incredible technology left behind, they counted themselves lucky that Germany had recognized the potential of jet power too late.
The jets were left absolutely untouched. Now, I was puzzled about this, frankly. What had motivated this? It certainly wasn't because it was overrun too quickly for them to have got rid of these jet aircraft. I think, deep down, it was a sense of pride of what they had achieved in the technical field, and they wanted us to see it.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, Thank you for watching.